Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This series that I'm calling Coding Utilities is a series meant to show you tools that you can write yourself to use as utilities in your day-to-day. They're not full-blown apps, but tools that you can use to make your own workflow better. In today's video, we'll be looking at how we can use Excel.js with Node to work with Excel files and potentially write CSV files. I don't know about you, but I have to keep working with a lot of Excel files. I share it with my colleagues and business partners, and I would love to be able to do that with code. In this video, we'll also look at how you can use REST APIs with Excel so you can capture information from the web. So if you're ready, let's go. So as you can see, I've opened up the Excel.js GitHub repository. This is for your reference. You can just take a look if you'd like. Their documentation is extensive, and we'll be using this library in today's video. We'll also be using JSON placeholder to hit so that we can get some dummy data and see how we can use this to write out Excel files. All right, so I've opened up my project in VS Code and I've called it Node Excel. And I've gone ahead and pulled in Excel.js using NPM. So let's get started and bring that into our workspace. So let's just say Excel is require Excel.js. And the first thing we want to do is create a workbook. If you're familiar with Excel at all, Excel has this concept of workbooks and worksheets. And so the first thing we want to do is create a workbook. Before that, I am going to create an async function block. Excel.js does work with promises and of course, has support for async await. And so we'll be using the async block. I am not using Node.js or ES modules. And so top level await does not exist. So let's go ahead first and create my workbook. And I'll say that's a new Excel workbook. We'll be creating a contacts list. So say you have a bunch of contacts that you'd like to keep track of, and you'd like to have them be in Excel. So the first thing we'll do, we'll say is our contacts worksheet is our workbook, and we say add a worksheet, and we'll give it a name. And this is the name that comes about in the tab, and we'll see what that looks like very quickly. So we'll call that contacts. Finally, we have to actually write this to disk. So we can do that by saying workbook. We'll write it in the XLSX format. It also supports CSV, which we won't write just yet, but it works in similar ways. We'll say XLSX, and we'll write it using an output stream. And so we'll just call it output stream, which I'm going to create in just a second. So I'll say my output stream is, well, we need the FS module. So let's go bring that in. FS create a write stream, and we'll call it contacts XLSX. And note that you do have to provide the extension, the file name extension. Excel.js does not add that in automatically. So with that out of the way, and we will have to await this because this returns a promise. With that out of the way, let's run this and see what happens. Let's say node index.js. And we can see here that it actually wrote a file. And you can see that it created an empty workbook with a contacts worksheet. Great. Excel.js does allow us to customize attributes of a worksheet, and you can look at the documentation for a whole list of options that you have, but we can look at a few here. So let's look at properties and give our tab a color. So we can say tab color, and we'll give it an ARGB value, and we'll say, we'll take it right out of the examples in the GitHub repo. And we'll give it the value of FFC000. If we run that again, you will see that the tab now has like this color. So it's pretty neat. Outside of providing just tab color, you can also set up the sheet. So typically, if you want to, let me just close this terminal here. If you'd like to perhaps print this out on a piece of paper, A4, A5, legal, whatever that may be, you have the ability to set that up here. So under page setup, we'll go ahead and add, well, I'd like this to be an orientation of landscape, and I'll give it a page size, paper size of, I'd like to say A4, but the way Node Excel works is they don't use names that are English or human readable. they actually, if I was to click through this, you will see that there's an enum that they expose, and A4 corresponds to the size 9. If you're using TypeScript, I'm using JavaScript today, but if you use TypeScript, you can actually import that and reference it here. So you could say Excel paper size A4, and this is a really nice developer experience. This will throw because this is referencing an enum value from JavaScript. It's not going to work. So I'm just going to go ahead and say 9, and let's see what happens. Again, I'll have to write this file. In fact, just to show you that it works, I'm going to remove contacts and run that file again. You can see here that the file disappeared, and run that file again. So we'll go ahead and open this up and see what happened. Coming here, we'll see that the size is correctly set to A4, and the orientation is landscape. It's selected here. I don't know if you can see it very well, but it is selected here as landscape. Notice here that the lines are actually showing us a landscape A4. Now, just to prove to you that this works, we can also just change this to 11. And from having run this before, I know that 11 is A5. And if we were to run this again, and open this up, you will see that the paper size is now A5. So that does give you a fair bit of customization, and that's really nice. Now, let's get to the actual stuff that we care about, is adding and working with the data. The way you do that is you get a hold of the worksheet and you say add row. Now, before you do this, there is one thing that you have to do. You need to set up your structure, your data itself. So the way you do that is you take the contacts worksheet and you set the columns on the worksheet. And so what I'm going to do is you give it an array of objects. And so here I'm going to say the key that I want to recognize this row by is going to be name. And the header value, and this is the thing that actually shows up in the Excel sheet, is going to be name. And maybe we can call that first name. All right. The second thing that I'd like to add, and since this is a contacts workbook, let's say we want to have the title of the person. Maybe it's a professional contact workbook that you're maintaining. Maybe something that you get off of LinkedIn, or you're building a lead list for your business. So you can say the header is going to be title. And then this could be like head of engineering, CTO, CEO, senior full stack engineer, whatever it may be. Finally, maybe we want their company name. So we'll say company, and the header, and the header will be company name. Now that we have this set up, let's add a row just to see if this works. So I'll go ahead and I'll say the name is, well, myself. The title is CTO, and the company is Texonic. Right? This is all the data, is all that you need to do to set up some data. So let's go ahead and write this to a file. So opening this file gives us this. So you can see it's fairly easy to actually write data to an Excel file, and it's pretty cool that you can do this. So let's add a couple of more bits of information just to see what it looks like. So let's take that and maybe add 2 more contacts. We'll say John Doe, which is your typical example, and he is a software engineer at Facebook. And we'll say Jane Doe, and she is a engineering manager at Netflix. All right, let's go write that out. And when we open that file, you see all of this stuff comes through. You can also adjust the width of these columns if you'd like. All you have to do is when you're creating the keys, you can give it a width property, and you can set a width here. Maybe you want to make it 10. You have some customization available. I'll let you look at the docs for this full list of things that you can do with this. You can also take the exact same data and write it as comma separated values, or CSV, and that'll do it as well. So if I was to change this to contacts.csv, that works as well. And if I was to open this up in VS Code, you will see that we have a comma separated list of all of the data. This is very useful if you're perhaps getting data from a form upload maybe, or you have data that's being exposed by an API that only sends out CSV. You can create workbooks and import them as CSV or Excel. And with that, let's actually move to how you can read CSV data or Excel data with Excel.js. So I've set up a little demo project here, and I have this groceries workbook. It's a little dummy data with 3 rows in it. And we'll see how we can read this file and actually work with the data that's present in this file. So here you can see I'm setting up a workbook and immediately reading that file, because a workbook in and of itself means nothing if it doesn't have any data. And so in one line, we're able to create the workbook and read it in. Next, I'm getting the worksheets from that. And here I'm just doing a little bit of a find and replace. But before I do this, I want to show you what worksheets look like. So let's do this. Let's console log the worksheets to see what it actually gives us. Clear out my screen. And I'm going to expand my terminal a little bit here so we can see what this does. When we do this, we actually see that we have one worksheet. Fair enough, because if you saw our grocery list, we just have one groceries worksheet. And so you can see that here in the code itself. This then you can see that the Excel.js is taking all of this stuff and creating data structures that we can use with Node.js, which is very nice. All right, so now that we have that, I really want to work with the groceries worksheet itself. You can see here that we have an array of worksheets, but I really want the specific groceries worksheet. So I'm going to get rid of that and look at just finding the groceries. So it's a simple find because it's an array, and a worksheet has a name property, and then we're going to use the name that we got. If I was to log that, you can imagine that we'll get the exact same thing, but it'll just be flattened to the single worksheet. So you can see here that we got the worksheet reference. Great. Now that we have that, you may want to like actually get this data out and start working with it, right? That's why you're reading the files. There's a few ways we can actually do that. So you can say groceries, get the rows. And if you look at get rows, it says, give me a start number and an end number. So because I have access to this sheet right in front of me, I know it has 4 rows. That includes the header. So I'm going to say, give it to me from the first row. It's index based, 1 index, not 0 index, to the 5th row. And let's see what that gives us. So let's see what that gives us. So if we did that and read it, you'll see that we get back a list of rows. But you can imagine that this is quite cumbersome, right? You don't want to be able to, if you have an Excel sheet with potentially thousands or tens of thousands of rows, you don't want to provide this manually. You don't want to give an arbitrary number because you could miss out some rows, or you don't want to count them. So the library gives us a handy little utility called actual row count. And so this makes it very dynamic. And if I was to do this, we'll still get back the same result. There's another little function that we can use. In fact, before I get to that, say you only wanted the row values, not really the row objects, as you see here. We can actually map over the rows, as I'm doing here. So I'm going to get rid of this console log, map over them, and just return the values. Let's log the raw values. And you can see here, we get back an array of arrays, and we have a bunch of stuff that we can use. Since this is such a common operation, the Excel.js library actually gives us some utilities that we can use to transform rows as they come out. So let's say groceries, there's a function called each row that takes a callback that gives us the row itself. There's another version of this that says include empty is false. If you remember, we saw an empty line. We don't want that. So we'll include that option and we'll get the row. And as a second argument, you get the row number, which we don't really care about. So what we'll do here is for each of those rows, we can actually console.log the row.values. Well, what's more interesting, I think, is to be able to destruct this into what we actually want. So if I use an array, let's say row.values, here I know that the first column is the name, and I'll have to look up what the others are. So that we have the name, the quantity, and the purchase date. So we can say name, quantity, and the purchase date is row.values, and we can now actually log an object that has those values. Now, if we go ahead and run that file, so the reason this happens is actually the first item in every row is actually empty. So we're going to go ahead and not include that. So we'll just use that as an underscore here. And if we run that again, you'll see that we actually get the values. Now, the first one is actually the header itself, which is pretty pointless, but you can filter those out if you need. So that's one way of working with it. You could also, for example, do this approach here. And instead of, say, returning row values, since we are mapping over it, we can actually get back the kind of materialized object that we saw just now, and we can return that instead. So instead of logging this out, we'll return these values. And we should have an array of row values that we can use with JavaScript. So if we did that again, probably get the same thing. So with the reading and writing out of the way, let's look at how we can work with Node.js and Excel, but fetching data from, let's say, a remote API. And for that, I'm going to use JSON placeholder. If you're not already familiar, JSON placeholder is a way for you to quickly access mock data. So they expose a few different resources. If you look at their website, you see that we have posts, comments, albums, photos, to-dos, and users. So it's a good way to test out an API or maybe test out a UI if you're building something, if you're building one of these things. And you can create resources. It's a free resource that you can use. So we're going to use this to take a bunch of to-dos and write them to a to-dos Excel sheet. So this should be fun. So in my project, I'm going to go ahead and create an API.js file. And behind the scenes, I've gone ahead and installed Axios for making the request to JSON placeholder. So the first thing we want to do is bring in Axios. So let's say require Axios. Since we are going to be writing this stuff to a file at a later point, we're going to bring in FS and Excel. Once again, because Axios is promise-based, we're going to use async await. Right? So let's make a request, and we'd say Axios make a get request to, and we need this URL here. So I'm going to copy that and paste that here. And we need to await that, of course. And Axios returns all of the data through a data property. So let's get that out. Let's look at what that looks like. So you can see here it's got a bunch of different items, but what we really care about here is the structure. So this is nice. So we have an ID property, the title of the to-do and whether the to-do is completed or not. There's also a user ID, which I think you can maybe make another call to the user's endpoint and fetch the user details, but perhaps we won't do that today. So let's just use the ID as maybe an incrementing key. The title and the completed property. Let's write these to an Excel file. All right, so we have a worksheet named to-dos like we saw before. Now all we need to do is write this data to that worksheet. Before we do that, we need to massage the data a little bit. If you see here, we need the keys ID, title, and completed as header rows, and the data itself will follow after that. So the way we can do that is using a little bit of mapping. So let's say object.keys of data of 0, because we only really care about any one of these items, and all of the response is held within an array. So my columns will be object of keys of this. So let's see what that looks like. Let's say console log, and we'll give it the columns. And I'll open up a new tab here so that we have a reference to this, just to see if everything's going okay. So if we ran API.js again, we get an array with 4 keys, which is what we expected, but we don't really want the user ID field. So let's see how we can remove that. Since this is an array, I can run functions on it, and I'll say this is maybe the key itself, and I'll return anything where the key is not equal to user ID. I'm sure there are better ways to do this, but this is a quick little way to getting what we want. So if you see that, we have all of the keys that we need. And so columns are set. And so we can say the to-dos columns is columns. And all we need to do now is iterate over our to-dos. So I'm going to say for let to-do of to-dos. And we'll say, actually, since it's a synchronous operation, like only the writing part is asynchronous. So what you can do is actually to-dos dot for each. Oops, for each. We have the row, or actually the to-do itself. We'll say worksheet, actually to-dos worksheet, which is the to-dos. We'll add a row and give it these values. So we care about the ID, that'll be to-do.id. We have a completed, but we want that later. We have a title property, so we'll say to-do.title, and completed will be to-do.completed. This should fill up the worksheet with a bunch of rows. And finally, what we can do is await workbook xlsx dot write, and we need to give it an output stream. But we also have write file, which should work. So let's look at this. Let's say to-dos dot xlsx. We'll save that and we'll run it and we'll see what happens. Node API.js. Oops, I'm sure the astute amongst you must have seen this, but really what we want is not the to-dos because that is a reference to our workbook. What we need is the data itself. I guess that's why good variable naming is important. So we'll take data.forEach and not to-dos for each. So data.forEach and to-dos.add row. That seems correct. And I'll open that up in VS Code itself, and we see that there's no data. And I think I know why this is the case. When we created the columns, we didn't actually give it the structure that it expects. So if you remember from when we wrote our context file, our columns were set as objects with keys and headers. And we have to do the same thing for our data here as well. So we can use map, and we'll have each of the, well, we can just call it a key, but we can call it the column name. And what we have to do is return here a key, which will be the column name. I suppose that's confusing. So let's just call it the key itself. And so this maps to ID, completed, and title. And we'll give it the header value of like the capitalized version of that value. So key.to uppercase. I think with this in place, it should work. So clear that out, run it again. And if we look here, we do see that we have all of the IDs and all of the data written out to Excel, which is very good. So guys, that's it for the video. If you liked it, please hit that like button. It really helps me out, get discovered on YouTube. And hit the subscribe button if you want to stay up to speed. Bye.